I think the general consensus of CGI is that, people are sick of it.
So what will $20,000 translate into? I'll give you the long and short: practical effects.
Everything you see in Dracula 87 will be practical and the highest skill possible. The challenge of this is that there's no editing with CGI and fixing in post. The blood feels real, the monsters look real, and every mistake is costly. But this is a challenge worth undertaking because it provides this sense of physicality that modern films are only really just discovering again.
I've always been really a big fan of movies. I just love, watching movies, and especially as a kid, I really loved seeing how movies were made. And so from a young age, I knew I always really enjoyed making things, especially, making like props and stuff like that, movie replicas and stuff. And, so I knew from relatively young age, like around teenage, I knew I wanted to do something in special effects. And eventually, I saw the show Face Off, which got me into the idea of doing special effects makeup specifically. And I'm a cosplayer as well, so I channel a lot of the knowledge that I've learned from special effects into doing stuff like that. And I really love using cosplay as a way of pushing the limits of what I can do in tackling more and more ambitious projects. And that sort of thing translates well into projects like these, where it's okay, now I have experience making full body creature suits and costumes, so I can translate that into a film project like this. So yeah, it's a lot of just sort of drawing inspiration from the movies that I enjoy the most, recreating it myself, and then finding a way to sort of funnel that knowledge into other projects.
In a CGI-based horror movie, the tension's not real, there's nothing for the actors to really work off of, whereas in movies that have practical effects like Iron Lung, you feel the pain, you feel the anguish, you feel the stress.
In this era of CGI that we live in, there are phenomenal things you can do with that tool. It is a tool. Practical effects are a tool. Computer effects are a tool. Whatever direction you want to go, there is no right or wrong answer. But if you want the authenticity of a 1980s movie, you're going to have the practical effects of the 1980s.
When I first read the script, two things that stood out to me most were, first and foremost, the werewolf. Knowing that, okay, we're going to have to make a full-body practical werewolf suit for this. And, this is something I haven't quite done before. We're talking a full-body muscle suit for, articulated jaw, head, that sort of stuff. And I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a really cool challenge to be able to create something like this.
My ultimate goal for this Seed&Spark campaign is to be able to reach our goal.
What excites me most about the idea of an added budget is pure set potential. In the original short, we were restricted to a single location, but with the added budget and added scenes of the script, we're able to do so much more from scene to scene.
Everyone on set was well prepared, able to make all of this flow through with, frankly, zero budget.
I made the micro short. I did that completely out of pocket. And my goal with the Seed&Spark, once I hit my funding, is to make the short, and once it's made, I'm going to circulate it in the festival circuit, and I plan to hopefully get it made into a feature-length film. So I'm climbing up that proof of concept ladder, and hopefully, I'll be able to bring my vision to life. Fingers crossed.
There are a number of ways one could really take this. As of late, most things are, grounded in realism. That's the sort of vibe that everyone's going for nowadays. But, when you look at stuff of the era, like Dawn of the Dead, for instance, the blood in that movie is very visibly fake. Romero and Tom Savini, they specifically wanted a sort of comic book feel to the blood. That's why they went for that bright red opaque blood. And so it really depends on what the director's vision is, but you could really take this one way or the other depending on exactly what you want the vibe in the moment to be. And even could change from scene to scene. You could use really, gross, realistic blood for one shot, and then decide, for another scene, it's like, okay, we want the vibe of this scene to be different. Let's go for a more, pulpy feel to it. And, that would change things completely.
Dracula 87 is a film defined by style, and to have anything less than the best lens available to us would be a massive hindrance.
Dracula's form and his transformation, the special effects in, older slasher films, they still hold up quite well today, even if they aren't always executed well, honestly. Because, there's always going to be something so endearing about the way a practical effect is made that even when you can tell that it's fake, it still has a sort of certain charm to it. And so, nowadays that we have, much higher definition cameras, these effects, these are under a lot more scrutiny now. So, you really have to step up your game in terms of detail and stuff like that, because, now when you're looking at, restored 4K cuts of, the classic horror movies, you get a lot more detail, and you're like, oh, wow, that doesn't look as great as I remember it looking. But, again, that's, part of the charm, is, these are, some of our favorite horror films were made on, a shoestring budget, and, subtle reminders like that are really part of what makes it such an enjoyable experience.
To play into the style of the 80s, I want to play with that feeling of flatness and heavy color contrast. The major aesthetic at the time was neon signs and video games, both of which are famous for their contrast of heavy, bright colors against a mostly solid black background on a 2D plane. This not only gives the colors an intense pop, but creates this somewhat unsettling feeling of being surrounded by darkness that just oozes horror movie tension.
One word: authenticity. The authenticity of everything in frame, every shirt, every advertisement, every product you see will be authentically 1980s. There will be no historical inaccuracies to this. We're going to go as authentic as possible down to get that 80s ooze. That 80s ooze will be dripping in every single shot of the picture.
Dracula 87 is hoping to innovate on a classic, to bring the feeling of gothic horror and the style of the 80s to the modern age of filmmaking.
What made me want to adapt Bram Stoker's Dracula into the 80s, I think it has to do with the fact that a lot of the social anxieties that were present when Bram Stoker wrote the original 1897 novel are very much present in the 80s, just in a different way.
I'm just a big, huge 80s nerd. I'm a nerd for anything 80s. I grew up on Journey music and the Eagles, Cinderella, Whitesnake. And so music is a big thing that always helps me get into characters, and it helps me get into Lucy's character a lot. I love my music, love my 80s music and 80s vibes. Big Stranger Things fan, so yeah.
In the 1890s, you had hysteria, you had women being sexually repressed, and, sexual tension for women in a time that was frowned upon, and sexual liberation, which men saw women being non-demure as threatening for some reason. And in the 80s, you have, a similar, wave of moral panics that would actually fit perfectly into the story of Dracula. You have the Satanic Panic, you have Reaganomics, you have this boom in homelessness that occurred, you have the AIDS crisis, you have the troubled teen industry, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on, and these things would actually be perfect. And then, you have the counterculture, which I think Bram Stoker, in his own way, was kind of making a commentary on. So when you flesh out these certain things, it only makes sense, even though there weren't that many adaptations of Dracula or stories featuring Dracula, probably because of the Iron Curtain, in the actual 80s, I feel like, it's a story that would thrive in that environment.
I'm just really excited about the concept of bringing Dracula and the 80s together. It just makes perfect sense. And we've never seen a Dracula adaptation in the 80s, and I'm so ready to play into the archetypes of characters and women that we saw in classic 80s movies. And I can't wait to kind of bring that to the iconic character of Lucy that we've also seen so much of throughout time, as this character Lucy has been shown in all these Dracula movies throughout time.
When I decided what scene from the feature-length film I was going to use for my short to kind of act as a proof of concept, it was natural that it would be, a slumber party scene, because, slumber parties are very keen to 80s tropes, and when you turn Dracula into like an 80s slasher, it kind of fits perfectly. You have Nightmare on Elm Street, you have Slumber Party Massacre.
I'm so ready. It's going to be so intense and dramatic and bold, and I'm ready. I'm so prepared. Put me in right now, coach.
Garden mazes are fantastically labyrinthian. They invoke both this feeling of getting lost in the untamed wilds of a forest, but due to the maintenance needed to trim them, they have this sense of intention that is perfect for creating a feeling of dread. A garden maze is a maze made from a series of smaller organisms. In that way, the very cage our characters are trapped in is alive and watching them, hunting them. I plan to keep that feeling of an endless maze throughout each shot, keeping them close, focused, and suffocating, with focus on high contrast lighting. The encroaching darkness of Dracula slowly surrounding and drowning out our protagonist.
So to create a gag like, blood coming out of a garden fountain, it'd be relatively straightforward, just be a matter of hooking up the, pump, whatever, pump the fountain is connected to, and just start kind of running blood into it, for if you were doing a quick changeover, it would be relatively simple. You would just, I guess, have the pump in, you just have the pump inside, your source of water, and then, you start rolling, fountain is pumping water as regular, and then, just dump some blood into the water reservoir, and, that blood's gonna get into the pump, and then, bam, your fountain is spouting out blood. And, it's pretty simple, but it's a pretty neat effect.
Oh, the partnership with 80s tees, it's everything, because Kevin, he's been, selling t-shirts, since that actual time period, and he grew up in the 80s, and, it brings that layer of authenticity to it. Having an authentic 80s wardrobe, between the t-shirts, the actual pajamas, and anything else, it's huge. It makes a difference because, the wardrobe, it defines the characters and it tells you everything you need to know about them. Their socioeconomic status, their aesthetic, their personalities. It's very, very, very important. In other adaptations of Dracula, you could see that. You could see, just in the way they're dressed, the differences between Mina and Lucy, where Lucy is more sexually open and Mina is more quiet and demure, and that's very, present, just in the way they dress. If you were to find an adaptation of Dracula and pause at a frame, even if you had never seen it before, you could immediately tell who's Mina and who's Lucy, because they're very, very distinct in their personality and in their dress. I've always felt an attachment of sorts to the role of Mina because, I always related to her. I related to what a kind, empathetic soul she was. I related to her compassion. I've also had this theory that, just from reading the subtext, that Mina might be on the spectrum like me. I'm pretty sure Mina's autistic, and, maybe it's just because I'm autistic, that's how I always interpreted her.
Lucy's out. Lucy's ready to get going. Lucy's ready. She's out for the hunt.
One of the things that always frustrated me was that in any adaptation of Dracula I've seen, you've never really seen the devastation that Mina feels when, Lucy has been her best friend for a lifetime, and, she was essentially tortured to death in her own home, no less. And, you would think Mina would be heartbroken and devastated, and you never get any reaction out of her in any adaptation other than a little bit of half-hearted crying, and that always frustrated me. Because, the questions I've always had are, well, first of all, Mina would be heartbroken and devastated, and secondly, once she sees that her childhood best friend, someone so close to her heart that they were interpreted in several adaptations and in the books as having a sapphic relationship, once she sees that she's been recruited into the Evil Dead, she would be horrified. And, I kind of wanted to capture that, in my movie. I feel like that's very important, because, that would be one of the most important things to capture, because they had such a close relationship, and, they meant everything to each other. You can see that in every adaptation there is. So it would be absolutely heartbreaking and horrifying that, her closest friend has been tortured to death and turned into this undead monster.
Dracula 87 is a film intending to reinvent a classic by bringing the vibe of the 80s and the intense nature of gothic horror to the modern day of filmmaking, and with your support, that is possible.
Horror fans, practical effects junkies, independent film champions, should you donate today? You should donate right now. Go to the link in the bottom, go to the link in the description, wherever the link is. Find the link, click on it, donate now, because when this movie comes out, when the whole feature comes out, when this has become part of a very big wave, you can say you were there day one.
I promise you that if you back my story and you back my movie, that you'll have the practical effects movie that you deserve, and you'll have the adaptation of Dracula that you've always wanted. I promise you it'll scratch every single itch about 80s movies and about Dracula that you could possibly ever have.
If the fans fully fund the campaign, I would say I'm definitely most excited for, creating these horrific monsters and just letting them run amok, especially if I get to be the one in the werewolf suit, which I'm quite excited about. And, I really just am very much looking forward to going absolutely feral inside a giant rubber and fur monster suit. That's all I'm asking for in life, is I just want to crash out in a monster suit and catch it all on camera.
This project just has so much heart going into it. We are all huge 80s nerds, huge gothic nerds, huge nerds in general, just nerding out and making this project work with our entire hearts and souls. And we're nerding out over this project, and we love it so much. And that's why I think people should back us. Please help us make this movie. It's gonna be amazing, and we're having an amazing time making it for you. See you soon.